This emulator has so many freaking ads. I thought emulators were supposed to help. Excuse me. Being sick sucks.
And bread. A 13... One of the most horrific cases of childhood tragedy ever documented will make you question the morality of modern science. And bread. A 13-year-old girl who had spent her entire life locked in a room, physically, mentally, and emotionally, was somehow a mix of Petri dish and Rosetta Stone that could unlock the mysteries of human language, because her brain was a blank slate at exactly the right time. It's a story of good intentions, horrible execution, greed, scholarly ambition, and the deepest depths of human suffering, all in the service of scientific progress. When you spend the most important developmental years of your life in total isolation, a decade of deranged solitary confinement and torture, what happens? Jeannie's discovery in 1970 was an accident. Her mother, Irene Wiley, was nearly blind from a mix of cataracts and neurological damage from being hit by the hand crank of a wringer washer. And that's why she walked into the wrong social services office with her daughter, a 13-year-old who weighed less than 60 pounds, walked like an injured bunny, and who still wore a diaper.
Visa. It was Visa that talked about it.
Words like
Okay.
mother and the
And now
colors
Visa is talking about it again in more detail.
and clawed, and she couldn't speak beyond uttering.
Unfortunately, I couldn't watch the uncensored version in time.
Stop it. Carl Linnaeus, the formalizer of binomial nomenclature and the father of biological taxonomy, would have classified Jeannie as Homo ferus, a distinctly separate strain of feral human. A New York Times writer classified her as a shattered creature. Jeannie's father, Clark, was incensed by any and all sound. Family had no TV or radio. Clark and Irene's first child died after being placed in the garage, probably to create distance from the crying. The 2-month-old infant succumbed to what was deemed to be quick pneumonia, but which was almost certainly exposure. Jeannie was tortured much more slowly. During the day, she was strapped to a potty training chair in a 10-foot by 10-foot room. There were 2 shaded windows and a single light bulb and nothing on the salmon-colored walls. A piece of wood leaned against one corner. Clark would beat Jeannie with it to punish her for making noise. At night, she was put in a crib with wire screens, basically a cage, and she was wrapped in a sleeping bag that researchers described as a straitjacket. She occasionally was allowed to play with 2 vinyl raincoats and an empty cottage cheese container. And when social workers tried to feed her, they discovered that she couldn't chew food. After a lifelong diet of baby food and other soft foods, she simply didn't know how. Jeannie's life was the most tragic case of childhood anyone involved in her care had ever seen or ever would see. And Jeannie also presented one of the most incredible scientific opportunities in modern history.
The girl reportedly was uttering infantile noises and still wearing diapers when a social worker discovered the case 2 weeks ago. But the authorities are hoping she still may have a normal learning capacity.
That was the question. What could a human being subjected to a lifetime of sensory, experiential, and social deprivation actually learn once immersed in a normal life? And the most interesting course of study was around language, because Jeannie's life coincided
What the hell was that? That was very cute.
Perfectly, with advances in linguistic theory that challenged literally thousands of years of wisdom. Real quick, this video is sponsored by BetterHelp. My video about happiness explored the complexity of how we conceptualize how people will listen and provide unbiased advice. It's France in 1800s. That's betterhelp.com/Vsauce. There have been a few notable cases of the feral child who existed in as close to a Hobbesian state of nature as we're likely going to get. Starting with Jean Itard's study of Victor of Aveyron, a wild child who emerged from a forest in France in 1800. Why don't we have thousands of cases like Victor and Janie to examine? Well, most people don't abandon kids in the woods or tie them to a potty training chair all day, and whether it's isolation, neglect, or abuse, kids in their circumstances tend to die before they can be rehabilitated physically and mentally, let alone be studied fully and ethically by scientists. But Jeannie checked all the boxes the natural world never lets us check. Could a girl who had virtually no exposure to language learn how to communicate with words despite being on the precipice of adulthood? Can a teenager learn to talk? What is bread?
So please,
You spent a lifetime learning about the nuances of bread without even realizing it. Jeannie was starting with literally nothing at 13 or 14 years old. First, it's got a name, bread, and eventually you learn that name. But is bread only the whole thing? When it gets sliced or ripped up, are those pieces also bread? Is there a new name for that, or does it have to be qualified with a new word like slice, which doesn't sound anything like bread? How small can slices get before it stops being bread and suddenly turns into a crumb? If there's a new name for when it gets tiny, why isn't there a new name when it's a huge collection, like on a rack at a bakery? This is French peasant bread. Are the brown ones like pumpernickel also bread, even though it looks nothing like this and tastes completely different? Fluffy leavened bread and compressed unleavened flatbreads are both bread. But if it's called dough and not bread when it's squishy before it's baked, is it still called bread when it's molded on the counter for a month? Is the hard outside a distinctly separate entity from the soft inside with different names, or is it all just bread? If the individual pieces, like the crust, have different names, why don't we list all those pieces when we talk about it? Why do we just lump together all those separate parts as bread, and how do we know when the components stop and the whole begins? You eventually discover that bread is food. Is it bread both before you it and as you completely transform it in your mouth and then pass it through your body? Is it still bread as you chew on it but stops being bread when you swallow? Why? And if we make a sandwich out of it, why do we stop noticing the bread? It's still there, it's the top and the bottom of the thing, but all of a sudden we're talking about a totally new word, sandwich. That has nothing to do with the sand at the beach or Halloween decorations or bread. If I have two of the same loaf, why would I talk about the bread as a singular unit? But if I sampled a few different breads, I wouldn't. And what is toast? These questions constitute only a portion of understanding what one single word in one language actually means, and vocabulary isn't even the interesting part. Two things were born in 1957. One was Jean. The other was a linguistic upheaval so significant that its publication is often just referred to as the event. Noam Chomsky was almost completely unknown when he published Syntactic Structures, which argued that humans don't learn or acquire grammar and syntax, they're born with a built-in sense of language construction that is wholly separate from the development of semantics, or the meaning of language. Around 300 BC, Epicurus theorized that man developed sounds as a reaction to what he saw and experienced in nature, but that only explains how we got words. Most everyone before and since thought language was a mixture of gift and curse from deities. It's such a complex phenomenon that there couldn't be any other explanation. Chomsky's theory rejected all of that, including the notion that we learn language from the other people around us, especially our parents. They just built on a universal grammar that was already contained. By the time Genie materialized in 1970, the field of linguistics had spent more than a decade at war with itself over the validity of Chomsky's syntactic structures, and Eric Levenberg's biological foundations of language complicated things even further by suggesting the critical period hypothesis that humans have a limited time frame from 2 years to the onset of puberty in which they can acquire language naturally. Genie was a perfectly imperfect test subject. She was as close to a blank slate as any researcher would ever get. Her critical period window had just closed, and they were about to find out whether she had a natural grammar and syntax programmed before birth. Was Chomsky right, or was it Levenberg? Were they both right? Or neither? Genie spent the first 13 years of her life in total isolation. She spent the next 13 years under the spotlight in the center ring of a big-top science circus. To be fair, no one really knew what to do with her. There was no playbook for this kind of case, and there were no rules beyond the law and general morality. Genie had been taken immediately out of the home. On the morning Clark and his wife were to appear in court on charges of willful abuse of a minor, he shot himself with a revolver. He left 2 notes, one to his son John, Genie's brother, whose Clark had routinely assaulted with a 3-foot board. John said, "I don't think he wanted me to have children, and it's a wonder I did," and that he would write me a note excusing me from gym so the kids didn't see my privates in the showers. The note to John told him where clothes would be for the funeral, and it ended with, "I love you. Goodbye, and be good." The other note was for the police. It said, "The world will never understand." The Children's Hospital's immediate concern was Genie's physical health and safety, and professionals from several disciplines tried to assess the situation. Dr. James Kent was the first to examine her. He said, "As far as I'm concerned, Genie was the most profoundly damaged child I've ever seen." And he concluded that Genie's life was a wasteland. Jay Shirley's field of expertise was the brain. He conducted sleep analysis that showed a high number of neural oscillations called sleep spindles, indicating to him that Genie had a degree of mental retardation. But despite having a very low functionality on some measures, she was perfectly normal on other tests that would have indicated a mental disability. What Genie did have was an incalculable number of problems and mysteries. Shirley said, "From being a totally neglected waif at the time I did my consultation, by the time I came back, Genie had become a prize. There was a contest about who was going to investigate her and how." Dr. David Rigler led the application for grant funding to study Genie through the National Institute of Mental Health. In February of 1971, they were approved for $21,500, the equivalent of about $150,000 today, to run through September of that year. What was actually going to be studied? Everything. What could a brain dormant for 14 years, undernourished and interspersed with bouts of what amounted to torture, eventually learn to do? Was it possible for researchers to even measure Genie's progress when their human subject first had to get used to other humans? And the first real experiment here was Genie studying Genie. Normal human development consists of seeing, hearing, touching, and experiencing things, all guided by veterans of humanity who have an interest in facilitating your advancement. That's usually your parents and family. You eventually learn that one person who's around all the time is some version of Mom, who is a distinctly separate being from yourself. And the big furry loud thing is a dog. And you like eating. But you don't like eating broccoli, especially when you'd rather be watching Coco Melon. And you begin to develop an internal monologue using those terms that draws on this increasingly organized catalog of information with greater efficiency and precision. The more you do and see, the larger that database, and the more you make use of it, the better you get at it. How does a child think, I want to watch Coco Melon, when they have no sense of the act of sitting down and watching a TV show, or Coco Melon is, or why he doesn't look like a real-life person, or why it's nicer to watch when the dog isn't barking, or why Mama trying to force broccoli down your gullet is a distraction, when that child doesn't know what anything is, or what anything is called, or how to express their relationship to any of it. What can even go on in their head? That was Jeannie, but with the entire world, and she was starting at 14. For her, even seeing things was hard. She had trouble focusing on anything beyond 10 feet away because she'd spent her life in a 10-foot by 10-foot room. She literally had never had to process with her eyes anything further away than the wall. She slowly began to get comfortable with the medical doctors and researchers, which was a serious conceptual hurdle. Jeannie had existed in a state of clinical egocentrism. Her entire world was just her. Now it was her and other people. But Dr. Kent felt that she could improve with relationships.
Up until one particular day, Jeannie didn't seem to respond in any special way to my coming or going at the end of our session. Then one day, when
Honestly, hearing all of
her
this,
expression changed from
what would have been more important for science wasn't researching her.
some sadness in the separation.
What would have been more important was getting someone to adopt her.
We were beginning to form this relationship.
For her to have a
She had the
proper
capacity
actual
for
family.
attachment, she had the capacity to learn, she had the capacity to get better.
And
This is
then
all frustrating to
something
hear.
Incredible happened. There's a video of a session with Jeannie that shows Jean Butler, a special education teacher who would become a major player in Jeannie's tragic life, trying to get Jeannie to tie her own shoes. Jeannie doesn't want to do it, and linguist Susan Curtis noted that she never really initiated anything, because how would she even know to?
Then we can hotel the weekend. You can't. Be tired.
A lot is happening here. In just a few months, Jeannie's vocabulary had grown from about 20 words to 100. If words were crayons, that's like going from a small set of basic colors like red and blue to a big box that even contains chicken nugget golden brown. It's not 32-bit, but it's serious progress. She knows that doctor refers to Dr. Kent, who is not in the room. It means she developed object permanence. She knows Dr. Kent exists even when he's not there. She's smiling and happy when she says she's proud of knowing the word. She's happy about making Jean Butler happy by saying it. She understands that the conceptual Dr. Kent will be happy too. She was starting to understand how the world worked. A headline proclaimed, "Doctors judge isolated girl able to learn." Right next to skinnies may take it easy, but how it's okay for underweight people to relax. And the researchers all adored Jeannie. She was a kind of prize and opportunity for them, but her innocence and emerging personality was magnetic.
Oh
Susan
no,
was
lolly scientists, lolicon
Tell us all of
scientists.
this good, just looking at her, that there was a lot to Jeannie, and that what we had to do was to make sure we gave her opportunities to express, find a way to take her
Oh
own
no,
language
she's a
and
lolicon.
express it, or somehow then, acquire it, because the potential just seemed so great.
Jeannie's progress
Hopefully I'm
was
just joking.
remarkable. And that was part of the problem.
Oh, we were off in a million directions. I mean, each expert, each person in their own discipline thought, oh, wow, I can do this, I can do this, I can do that. We were flooded with our own associations and with the pursuits that each of us might have thought, wow, look what we can do. Look what we might learn from this. A girl who has appeared out of nowhere.
As the NIMH grant progressed and was renewed, they started to ask questions about what was really going on with the research. To them, it seemed unfocused. It wasn't clear what anyone was trying to accomplish scientifically. Susan Curtis's work on Jeannie's linguistic development...
Bro, they're trying to raise a child.
She tracked how Jeannie eventually produced two-word phrases with verbs, like a subject plus verb construction, Dave hurt, or Curtis come, and verb plus object constructions like shake hand, because she was thinking in language, not simply mimicking the adults around her. She occasionally used plurals, and her emotional development led to reactions like, "Go away, Joel,